All right. I'm Gavin Silvernagel. I chose the article Adult Neuroplasticity, More Than 40 Years of Research. So, what is it? What is neuroplasticity? It's the brain's ability to adapt, reorganize, and change its structure and function. Why does this matter? It challenges old beliefs that the adult brain is fixed, explaining learning, memory, and recovery after brain injuries. Um, those brain injuries could be something such as like a stroke or something. What's the purpose of this article? This article reviews evidence showing that adults still have significant neuroplasticity well into later life. So, a little bit of background about this article. Historically, scientists have believed that neuroplasticity mainly happens in children. Early theories believe that adult brains have limited ability to change, such as like males, their brain fully develops and stops at 25. Like I said, they're actually showing that it happens a lot later in life as well, and never really truly stops. Um, and then there's over 40 years worth of research finding that adults can still grow new neurons in a process called neurogenesis that'll get brought up quite a bit, and rewire the connections. So this article mainly summarizes the key breakthroughs in adult neuroplasticity from both animal and human studies. So, what is adult neuroplasticity? A little bit more in depth here. Um, Adult neuroplasticity involves structural changes, functional changes, and then there's also triggers. Um, so, some structural ones are things like the growth of new neurons, neurogenesis, the formation of new dendritic branches and synapses, and also the change in neuron size and shape. There's the functional changes include strengthening or weakening of synapses. That could be for a number of things, and new pathways forming after injury. So that include things like stroke. Some strokes, people experience the loss of their speech, and they actually have to go through speech therapy to kind of get back to that speaking. So, you lose that and then have to regain it. So you're kind of looking at new pathways forming to regain that speech concept. Um, there's also conditional triggers to plasticity, including stress, learning, environment, exercise, and hormones, all things covered in this article. So, the key research focus in this article, there are six main things: neurogenesis in adult hippocampus, the effects of stress on the brain plasticity, hormonal influences, that's things like cortisol and sex hormones, such as estrogen, they actually found is very beneficial. Environmental enrichment, that could be things like a rat in a cage versus a rat in a cage with toys and a wheel, to run on. So just those little things. And then the reversibility of neural changes, and then clinical implications, kind of going back to those brain injuries and strokes and stuff like that. So the experimental procedure, there's five main experiments they kind of ran that I got out of the article. There were animal models they used, such as rats and primates. They mainly used these because they're similar enough to the human brain for what they were doing, just on the cellular level, and then also the stress responses. The stress manipulation, animals were exposed to chronic social and physical stress. Research observed these in the hippocampus and prefrontal cortex as well in these animals. There was environmental enrichment, kind of like I talked about. Animals were introduced to toys, social interaction, and things like the exercise wheel compared to their standard cages to measure their brain growth when these were introduced. The neurogenesis measurements, brain slices of these animals were stained and used to identify the neurons. They used a microscopic imaging to individually count the new cells that were produced. And then hormone manipulation, things like cortisol and sex hormones are what they kind of used because those had the biggest implication on stress. And then they observed the effects of neuron structure in the synapses. So the experimental outcome, what did they actually find? So they found that stress shrinks neurons, so it literally alters the brain. Chronic stress causes shrinking of dendrites, the loss of synaptic connections, and reduced neuron survival. Enrichment grows neurons, right? This is another thing they found. Stimulating environments increase dendritic branching, synapses, and adult neurogenesis. So you kind of see the two there, an enriched environment versus like a stressful environment there. So pretty much the exact opposite. And then hormones play a big role. Cortisol, again, your stress hormone. And then, again, some hormones such as estrogen increasing growth and synaptic formation. And then the evaluation of the evidence, obviously, there were strengths and limitations. Strengths include like 40 years of consistent data that they've actually been studying this, neuroplasticity and neurogenesis. There were multiple species studied, between primates, rodents, humans, not as much humans, but there's also biological mechanisms identified in the brain. And then there were real-world health implications for mental health, recovery, and learning. Mental health disorders, recovery in the sense of like strokes, traumatic brain injuries, and then just learning about the brain too. But obviously with strengths there has to come limitations, including human brains are more complex than animal brains. You look at a rat brain and you look at a human brain, look at the size, look at the cortexes, everything's more complicated. It's also very difficult to measure neurogenesis from what I got in the article. Some effects of, the stress environment vary. And then not all findings are equal to every brain region. So, your environmental and your stress might shift a little. And if you're looking at the same part every single time in a human, and if it shifts, you're going to get different results. So, again, why does this really matter to humans? Continue learning. It shows that adults can continue learning and adapting well into later life. It doesn't just have a specific stop date. Recovery, it explains recovery from strokes and brain injury, which I've said enough. And then mental health, it helps understand mental health disorders, and like I said, stress literally alters the brain, so that's where that kind of comes from. And then just life in general, it supports the importance of exercise, healthy environments, healthy diets, and stress management. What improvements could be made that I got from it? I got a few things. More human studies, they mainly focused on rodents and primates, which is understandable. Human studies are discouraged and could be counted as immoral, but still. Longer term studies, a lot of these only ran for a few months at a time, so you could have less variation, as a longer study could be. More diversity, rather than looking just into rodents and primates, looking into different species as well that, maybe this animal has different properties that are closer to humans than a primate or a rodent, So just looking into it, maybe getting a broader spectrum. Standardized stress, a rodent isn't going to have the same stress response as a primate. So by using the same two stress, like I said before, isn't going to give you the same result. So just having a standardized stress instead of using a bunch of different ones. And then just more real-world applications. Like I said with the stroke, actually looking into how does the brain rewire itself to teach itself to speak again after the loss of speech during a stroke. It doesn't happen to everyone, but still, just looking into how that actually works. So in conclusion, adult neuroplasticity, it's real and it's significant. The brain is adaptable through life. It doesn't just stop, obviously a male develops until they're about 25, but it continues developing too, male and female. Stress, hormones, and environments literally reshape the brain. Hormones such as, cortisol and estrogen, like the article mainly focused on, and then environment, toys, exercise wheels, stuff like that. And then research, it supports new therapies, learning, and recovery to further human health. So, thank you. This is the article, Adult Neuroplasticity, more than 40 years of research that I used. This is the only article that I use. So, thank you.